Section 19 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Madame Swann at Home, Part 19. But as time went on, every refusal to see her disturbed me less. And as she became less dear to me, my painful memories were no longer strong enough to destroy by their incessant return the growing pleasure which I found in thinking of Florence or of Venice. I regretted at such moments that I had abandoned the idea of diplomacy and had condemned myself to a sedentary existence, in order not to be separated from a girl whom I should not see again and had already almost forgotten. We construct our house of life to suit another person, and when at length it is ready to receive her, that person does not come. Presently she is dead to us, and we live on, a prisoner within the walls which were intended only for her. If Venice seemed to my parents to be a long way off, and its climate treacherous, it was at least quite easy for me to go, without tiring myself, and settle down at Baalbec. But to do that I should have had to leave Paris, to forego those visits, thanks to which, infrequent as they were, I might sometimes hear Madame Swann telling me about her daughter. Besides, I was beginning to find in them various pleasures in which Gilbert had no part. When spring drew round, and with it the cold weather, during an icy Lent and the hail storms of Holy Week, as Madame Swann began to find it cold in the house, I used often to see her entertaining her guests in her furs, her shivering hands and shoulders hidden beneath the gleaming white carpet of an immense rectangular muff and a cape, both of ermine, which she had not taken off in coming in from her drive, and which suggested the last patches of the snows of winter, more persistent than the rest, which neither the heat of the fire nor the advancing season had succeeded in melting. And the whole truth about these glacial but already flowering weeks was suggested to me in this drawing-room, which soon I should be entering no more, by other more intoxicating forms of whiteness, that, for example, of the guelder roses clustering at the summits of their tall, bare stalks, like the rectilinear trees in pre-Raphaelite paintings, their balls of blossom, divided yet composite, white as annunciating angels, and breathing a fragrance as of lemons. For the mistress of Tansonville knew that April, even an ice-bound April, was not barren of flowers, that winter, spring, summer are not held apart by barriers as hermetic as might be supposed by the town dweller, who until the first hot day imagines the world as containing nothing but houses that stand naked in the rain. That Madame Swann was content with consignments furnished her by her Combray gardener, that she did not, by the intervention of her own special florist, fill up the gaps left by an insufficiently powerful magic with subsidies borrowed from a precocious Mediterranean shore, I do not for a moment suggest, nor did it worry me at the time. It was enough to fill me with longing for country scenes, that overhanging the loose snowdrifts of the muff in which Madame Swann kept her hands, the guelder rose snowballs, which served very possibly in the mind of my hostess no other purpose than to compose, on the advice of Bergot, a symphony in white with her furniture and her garments, reminded me that what the Good Friday music in Parsifal symbolized was a natural miracle one could see performed every year, if one had the sense to look for it, and assisted by the acid and heady perfume of the other kinds of blossom, which, although their names were unknown to me, had brought me so often to a standstill to gaze at them on my walks round Combray, made Madame Swann's drawing-room as virginal, as candidly in bloom, without the least vestige of greenery, as overladen with genuine scents of flowers as was the little lane by Tansonville. But it was still more than I could endure that these memories should be recalled to me. There was a risk of their reviving what little remained of my love for Gilbert. Besides, albeit I no longer felt the least distress during these visits to Madame Swann, I extended the intervals between them and endeavored to see as little of her as possible. At most, since I continued not to go out of Paris, I allowed myself an occasional walk with her. Fine weather had come at last, and the sun was hot. As I knew that before luncheon Madame Swann used to go out every day for an hour, and would stroll for a little in the Avenue de Bois, near the Étoile, a spot which, at that time, because of the people who used to collect there to gaze at the swells whom they knew only by name, was known as the Shabby Genteel Club. I persuaded my parents on Sundays, for on weekdays I was busy all morning, to let me postpone my luncheon until long after theirs, until 1:15, and go for a walk before it. During May that year I never missed a Sunday, for Gilbert had gone to stay with friends in the country. I used to reach the Arc de Triomphe about noon. I kept watch at the entrance to the avenue, never taking my eyes off the corner of the side street along which Madame Swann, who had only a few yards to walk, would come from her house. As by this time many of the people who had been strolling there were going home to luncheon, those who remained were few in number, and, for the most part, fashionably dressed. Suddenly, on the gravelled path, unhurrying, cool, luxuriant, Madame Swann appeared, displaying around her a toilette which was never twice the same, but which I remember as being typically mauve. Then she hoisted and unfurled at the end of its long stalk, just at the moment when her radiance was most complete, the silken banner of a wide parasol of a shade that matched the showering petals of her gown. A whole troop of people escorted her. Swann himself, 4 or 5 fellows from the club, who had been called upon her that morning, or whom she had met in the street, in their black or grey agglomeration, obedient to her every gesture, performing the almost mechanical movements of a lifeless setting in which Odette was framed, gave to this woman, in whose eyes alone was there any intensity, the air of looking out in front of her, from among all those men, as from a window behind which she had taken her stand, and made her emerge there, frail but fearless, in the nudity of her delicate colors, like the apparition of a creature of a different species, of an unknown race, and of almost martial strength, by virtue of which she seemed by herself a match for all her multiple escort. Smiling, rejoicing in the fine weather, in the sunshine which had not yet become trying, with the air of calm assurance of a creator who has accomplished his task and takes no thought for anything besides. Certain that her clothes, even though the vulgar herd should fail to appreciate them, were the smartest anywhere to be seen, she wore them for herself and for her friends, naturally, without exaggerated attention to them, but also without absolute detachment, not preventing the little bows of ribbon upon her bodice and skirt from floating buoyantly upon the air before her, like separate creatures of whose presence there she was not unconscious, but was indulgent enough to let them play if they chose, keeping their own rhythm, provided that they accompanied her where she led the way, and even upon her mauve parasol, which, as often as not, she had not yet put up when she appeared on the scene. She let fall now and then, as though upon a bunch of Parma violets, a gaze happy and so kindly that when it was fastened no longer upon her friends, but on some inanimate object, her eyes still seemed to smile. She thus kept open. She made her garments occupy that interval of smartness, of which the men with whom she was on the most familiar terms respected both the existence and its necessity, not without showing a certain deference, as of profane visitors to a shrine, an admission of their own ignorance, an interval over which they recognized that their friend had, as we recognize that a sick man has over the special precautions that he has to take, or a mother over her children's education, a complete jurisdiction. No less than by the court which encircled her and seemed not to observe the passers-by, Madame Swann, by the lateness of her appearance there, at once suggested those rooms in which she had spent so long, so leisurely a morning, and to which she must presently return for luncheon. She seemed to indicate their proximity by the unhurrying ease of her progress, like the turn that one takes up and down one's own garden. Of those rooms one would have said that she was carrying about her still the cool, the indoor shade. But for that very reason the sight of her gave me only a stronger sensation of open air and warmth. All the more because, being assured in my own mind that in accordance with the liturgy, with the ritual in which Madame Swann was so profoundly versed, her clothes were connected with the time of year and of day by a bond both inevitable and unique. I felt that the flowers upon the stiff straw brim of her hat, the baby ribbons upon her dress, had been even more naturally born of the month of May than the flowers in gardens and in woods. and to learn what latest change there was in weather or season, I had not to raise my eyes higher than to her parasol, open and outstretched like another, a nearer sky, round, clement, mobile, blue. For these rights, if they were of sovereign importance, subjugated their glory, and consequently Madame Swann her own, in condescending obedience to the day, the spring, the sun, none of which struck me as being sufficiently flattered that so elegant a woman had been graciously pleased not to ignore their existence, and had chosen on their account a gown of a thinner fabric, suggesting to me, by the opening of its collar and sleeves, the moist warmness of the throat and wrists that they exposed. In a word, had taken for them all the pains that a great personage takes, who, having gaily condescended to pay a visit to common folk in the country, whom every one, even the most plebeian, knows, yet makes a point of donning, for the occasion, suitable attire. On her arrival, I would greet Madame Swann. She stopped me, and say in English, "Good morning," and smile. We would walk a little way together, and I learned then that these canons, according to which she dressed, it was for her own satisfaction that she obeyed them, as though yielding to a superior wisdom of which she herself was high priestess. For if it should happen that, feeling too warm, she threw open or even took off altogether, and gave me to carry the jacket which she had intended to keep buttoned up, I would discover in the blouse beneath it 1,000 details of execution which had had every chance of remaining there unperceived, like those parts of an orchestral score to which the composer has devoted infinite labor, albeit they may never reach the ears of the public. Or in the sleeves of the jacket that lay folded across my arm I would drink in slowly, for my own pleasure, or from affection for its wearer, some exquisite detail, a deliciously tinted strip, a lining of mauve satinette, which ordinarily concealed from every eye, was yet just as delicately fashioned as the outer parts, like those Gothic carvings on a cathedral, hidden on the inside of a balustrade 80 feet from the ground, as perfect as are the bas-reliefs over the main porch, and yet never seen by any living man, until happening to pass that way upon his travels, an artist obtains leave to climb up there among them, to stroll in the open air, sweeping the whole town with a comprehensive gaze between the soaring towers. What enhanced this impression that Madame Swann was walking in the avenue as though along the paths of her own garden was, for people ignorant of her habit of taking exercise, that she had come there on foot, without any carriage following, she whom, once May had begun, they were accustomed to see, behind the most brilliant turnout, the smartest liveries in Paris, gently and majestically seated like a goddess in the balmy air of an immense victoria on 8 springs. On foot, Madame Swann had the appearance, especially as her pace began to slacken in the heat of the sun, of having yielded to curiosity, of committing an exclusive breach of all the rules of her code, like those crowned heads who, without consulting anyone, accompanied by the slightest scandalized admiration of a suite which dares not venture any criticism, step out of their boxes during a gala performance and visit the lobby of the theatre, mingling for a moment or two with the rest of the audience. So between Madame Swann and themselves the crowd felt that there existed those barriers of a certain kind of opulence which seem to them the most insurmountable that there are. The Faubourg Saint-Germain may have its barriers also, but these are less telling to the eyes and imagination of the shabby genteel. These latter, when in the presence of a real personage, more simple, more easily mistaken for the wife of a small professional or business man, less remote from the people, will not feel the same sense of their own inequality, almost of their unworthiness, as dismays them when they encounter Madame Swann. Of course, women of that sort are not themselves dazzled, as the crowd are, by the brilliance of their apparel. They have ceased to pay any attention to it, but only because they have grown used to it. That is to say, have come to look upon it more and more as natural and necessary, to judge their fellow creatures according as they are more or less initiated into these luxurious ways, so that, the grandeur which they allow themselves to display or discover in others being wholly material, easily verified, slowly acquired, the lack of it hard to compensate, if such women place a passer-by in the lowest rank of society, it is by the same instinctive process that has made them appear to him as in the highest, that is to say, instinctively, at first sight, and without possibility of appeal. Perhaps that special class of society which included in those days women like Lady Israels, who mixed with the women of the aristocracy, and Madame Swann, who was to get to know them later on, that intermediate class, inferior to the Faubourg Saint-Germain, since it ran after the denizens of that quarter, but superior to everything that was not of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, possessing this peculiarity, that while already detached from the world of the merely rich, it was riches still that it represented, but riches that had been canalized, serving a purpose, swayed by an idea, that were artistic, malleable gold, chased with a poetic design, taught to smile. Perhaps that class, in the same form at least, and with the same charm, exists no longer. In any event, the women who were its members would not satisfy today what was the primary condition on which they reigned, since with advancing age they have lost, almost all of them, their beauty. Whereas it was, just as much from the pinnacle of her noble fortune, from the glorious zenith of her ripe and still so fragrant summer, that Madame Swann, majestic, smiling, kind, as she advanced along the Avenue de Bois, saw, like Hypatia, beneath the slow tread of her feet, worlds revolving. Various young men as they passed looked at her anxiously, not knowing whether their vague acquaintance with her, especially since, having been introduced only once, at the most, to Swann, they were afraid that he might not remember them, was sufficient excuse for their venturing to take off their hats. And they trembled to think of the consequences as they made up their minds, asking themselves whether the gesture, so bold, so sacrilegious a tempting of Providence, would not let loose the catastrophic forces of nature or bring down upon them the vengeance of a jealous God. It provoked only, like the winding of a piece of clockwork, a series of gesticulations from little, responsive, bowing figures, who were none other than Odette's escort, beginning with Swann himself, who raised his tall hat lined in green leather with an exquisite courtesy, which he had acquired in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, but to which was no longer wedded the indifference that he would at one time have shown. Its place was now taken, as though he had been to some extent permeated by Odette's prejudices, at once by irritation at having to acknowledge the salute of a person who was none too well dressed, and by satisfaction at his wife's knowing so many people. A mixed sensation to which he gave expression by saying to the smart friends who walked by his side, "What, another? Upon my word, I can't imagine where my wife picks all these fellows up." Meanwhile, having greeted with a slight movement of her head the terrified youth, who had already passed out of sight, though his heart was still beating furiously, Madame Swann turned to me. "Then it's all over?" she put it to me. "You aren't ever coming to see Gilbert again? I'm glad you make an exception of me and are not going to drop me straight away. I like seeing you, but I used to like also the influence you had over my daughter. I'm sure she's very sorry about it, too. However, I mustn't bully you, or you'll make up your mind at once that you never want to set eyes on me again. Odette, Sagan's trying to speak to you." Swann called his wife's attention. And there indeed was the prince, as in some transformation scene at the close of a play, or in a circus, or an old painting, wheeling his horse round so as to face her, in a magnificent heroic pose, and doffing his hat with a sweeping theatrical and, so to speak, allegorical flourish, in which he displayed all the chivalrous courtesy of a great noble bowing in token of his respect for woman, were she incarnate in a woman whom it was impossible for his mother or sister to know. And every moment, recognized in the depths of the liquid transparency and of the luminous glaze of the shadow which her parasol cast over her, Madame Swann was receiving the salutations of the last belated horsemen, who passed as though in a cinematograph taken as they galloped in the blinding glare of the avenue, men from the clubs, the names of whom, which meant only celebrities to the public, Antoine de Castellane, Adalbert de Montmorency, and the rest, were for Madame Swann the familiar names of friends. And as the average span of life, the relative longevity of our memories of poetical sensations is much greater than that of our memories of what the heart has suffered, long after the sorrows that I once felt on Gilbert's account have faded and vanished, there has survived them the pleasure that I still derive, whenever I close my eyes and read, as it were upon the face of a sundial, the minutes that are recorded between 12:15 and 1 o'clock in the month of May, from seeing myself once again strolling and talking thus with Madame Swann beneath her parasol, as though in the colored shade of a wisteria bower. End of section 19.